Hey guys, welcome back to the Making of Skurge series. This is part 2. And this time we're going to be tackling the armor. This armor right here. For this armor I'm going to be using mostly Lumen's foam, but in a future video I'm going to be testing out some foam from Red Moon Cosplay Supplies, so do stay tuned for that. Especially if you're in Canada, they're a Canadian supplier. Now, most of this armor is going to be made out of foam, but we're also going to be working a little bit with some Warbler. We're going to be doing a little bit of resin casting and mold making, and we're going to be playing a lot with adding texture to a piece, since this is the perfect build for endless sanding. In all seriousness though, I did really like working on this project. I love the character so much, in fact, that there's going to be more parts coming in the future because I decided to make every prop associated with the character. Anyways, let's not get ahead of ourselves, let's work on the armor. To pattern the chest piece, I've enveloped my dress form in cling wrap and covered half of it in duct tape before sketching the shapes from the reference. As you may have noticed, I am not at all shaped like Karl Urban, the actor who plays Skurge, so shapes will have to be a little bit different. Each piece is cut out with as many seams as strategically placed as possible to allow the pieces to sit flat. I plan on making this out of foam, so it doesn't need to be perfectly flat since foam can stretch into shape, within reason, of course. The outline was traced to paper for more precision and registration marks cut out. The majority of these pieces for Skurge I'm going to make using 4mm foam, which is my favorite thickness. A sharp blade is best to ensure clean results when cutting. I use the Kershaw blade sharpener. This is back when my Renia contact cement would live in a squeeze bottle. All the pieces are seamed together in preparation for the overlaid details and texture. I want to mimic this shape right here in the chest plate, so I'm carving in a bevel with my X-Acto without going all the way through. I used to do this step with hot glue, but with all the heat shaping I do, I started using contact cement instead. Now I can connect the cups to each other and the lower half of the chest plate. Here is said heat shaping that would have melted the glue. I'm using an acrylic hemisphere, but a knee works just fine too. My videos aren't necessarily meant as tutorials since I'd have to go way more in depth with every step, but for everyone trying to learn something, you don't need fancy tools to get the job done, but you'll probably accumulate some over time like I have. Now that the base is ready, I'm tracing where the other layers will go and then marking where I need to carve texture. I want to avoid putting texture where anything else needs to be glued on in order to have a flat surface for those bits. Then the details are glued onto the non-textured spots. There's a lot of back and forth from the desk to the sanding station involved in this project, but it's okay, I survived. This piece right here is pretty important because it's going to help my chest piece hold a nice curved shape. That's why I'm gluing it on while it's on my dress form so that I can glue in the proper curve. Now that all the bits are on, I can start adding the trim. At this point, I realized the cups were flaring out a little bit too much, so I opted to add darts. Luckily, the texture from the surface will help hide this adjustment. Now listen, I often struggle to show my pattern process since it's usually pretty absurd and disorganized unless you're in my mind. Anyways, I'm patterning the collar area with tape and paper, and then I make adjustments with more tape. To sit at a nice angle with its corresponding piece, I'm cutting this edge at a 45-degree angle. I drew where I would normally be gluing the strip. I don't want any extra thickness here, so instead I'm going to slightly cut into the foam along the outline. Then I'm heat shaping the piece and allowing the carved out area to separate. It's a bit of a strange area to get footage of, but I sanded that bit down and then added the texture. I had done on purpose to glue the strips a bit too far so I can trim it at the right spot. And again, a lot of the gluing for this took place on my dress form for shaping purposes. Now listen, like I said, I fear this video might drag on a little bit long, so I won't go into every other step for every piece since a lot of it is repetition. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments for me. All the edges are cleaned up, some final heat shaping, and the heat sealing before I can begin patterning the stomach area pieces. The opening was traced to allow me to work within a specific shape. You'll notice you can see some of the same red fabric of the shirt under the armor, and this is how I plan on dealing with this section. It'll make sense later, but I don't want to glue stuff to the shirt itself. It's in moments like this that I really wish I had a laser cutter, but I still managed to cut all these tiny pieces by hand. Unfortunately, these aren't the only pieces like this I'll have to make. I say unfortunately, but I did really enjoy making this costume. Now what really got me though was applying glue to these pieces and having them stay stuck to my fingers. Okay, so the chest piece is still not done. They're still missing all these little pieces like the belt holes and the modesty panel. The modesty panel is sanded in areas meant to be glued before being stuck on. And now here's what I was talking about with the red from the shirt. This Velcro will correspond to Velcro in the chest piece. It'll mimic the shirt underneath, giving a non-moving area for these tiny pieces, and help keep the chest piece closed all at once. For maximum glue safety, the foam is scored and opened up with heat. Now the hot glue has a decent amount of surface to grip into. Oh, and I can't forget the googly eye rivets I'm sticking on with E6000. These are just holding on with tape for now, by the way. Now that we have our chest piece all constructed, all that's missing now is the closures. Here's more of that couch vinyl from the modesty panel. I went a little crazy with the fabric glue. I wanted perfectly flat edges before sewing them on with a triple stitch. The buckles are added to half of them and the other half got eyelets. After quick sealing the seams, I dispose of a body real quick. These things happen so unexpectedly. Anyways, that body was used to prime the chest piece with 4 or 5 layers of Plasti-Dip, and now I move on to the belt. Like I said, I'm going to go over these repeat steps pretty quickly. Pattern with paper and tape, details sketched on, foam, glue, marking, and now some of the texture. By the way, the texture was done with a stone bit to add a hammered look. Next layer, details traced on and then textured, details glued, and second layer added to the base. Hip pieces measured and patterned, details sketched, foam, the realization that it was going to be too small and needed to be wider. That's okay, the other pieces of foam will go to use for something else. Foam thickness messes with pattern pieces when curved since it takes into account the distance traveled for the uppermost surface. I feel like that made no sense. It does though. So each new piece has to be widened to take into account that curve. I'm connecting it end to end and then curving the foam into the glue to connect the middle. Again, edge cleanup with Quick Seal. I did 2 layers of Quick Seal on this costume to make the areas seamless, and of course it's smooth with water after it's applied. I'm using a gem mold I already have to cast this blue gem thing that goes into the belt. There will be more mold and resin related stuff later. I had toyed with the idea of making the hip plate removable, but I decided against it, so they're glued on. This detail isn't on the original, but I plan on making a pouch that'll go here for conventions. Here's some more unorthodox pattern making. Ignore the shoulder armor and pretend it's not made yet. From that trace bit, the flaps get patterned. They get traced to that couch vinyl, a large stack cut out, and then pillowcase seamed. To turn inside out, the edges are trimmed and the corners are snipped. Then this. This step sucks. Lots of pinching and clipping. Triple stitch along the edge like the straps, and then these patterns come in handy again to place the flaps together. They're all stitched together with some bias tape scrap, and then set aside until further notice. Alright, so when it comes to making a mold of something, I'm not a pro at it. I'll show you my process for these pieces anyways, but if there's someone out there who can let me know if this method is dumb, please do. It all starts with foam and then some sanding, then I cover it with Warbler. This is the piece we're working on, by the way. The Warbler gets spackle, silicone is poured on top, and then I cast it in plaster of Paris, sand it even smoother with more crisp angles, and remold it in silicone again. Now I do my resin. I also did a mold of 5 studs so I wouldn't have to do them one at a time. Then there's this thing right here which gave me a lot of trouble in finding a reference. I eventually figured it out and it was cut out of foam. The arms have a lot of these little flat pieces I'm initially drawing out on paper. I'm using this strip for a lot of the patterning, that way I can use long cut strips of foam that are all uniform. This pink highlighter business is where to sever the pieces for an intentional seam. As per usual, the bits are traced onto the base so I can know where to put my glue and where to line things up. Then of course the pieces are glued, unwanted seams are quick sealed and sanded lightly. Let's go through this one a little bit more quickly and I'll show you more in depth for the shoulders. My bracers I'm patterning with cling wrap and tape, tracing it onto paper, slashing the paper to trace the border, foam, texture, erase details. This could have been paper, but oh well, I'm not always the brightest. Hindsight's always 20/20. Tape the underside with the sleeve's thickness to pattern the top. Now the rest of this is built up layer per layer. Another bevel here for shaping, etc. I'm sanding a little taper into the detail here so it seems continuous, but can lay flatter on the top layer. These weird things are sanded and I have to make 4 identical ones. And to be honest, they all came out pretty similar. I could have casted them, but it was good practice. The slash marks come in handy again for where to connect the top to one side only. The other will close differently. Then more stuff is glued onto the bracer. Holes are half cut, and heat is used to open it up. I guess I somewhat lied about going through this part quickly. There's still a few little bits to add, and now it's this front flap bit and a back triangle bit. You know the drill from that time I made the upper arm pieces. Making costumes is really just a lot of repetition, and the trick is to not let yourself get lazy along the way. The less you allow yourself to cut corners, the nicer work you'll produce. Along with practice, of course, but I can't stress enough how much patience is a big factor in your end product. That being said, we all cosplay for different reasons. Some of us like to push our work quality as far as possible, and others really just want to have fun with friends and wear a cosplay in order to connect with people. Much like every other step, I patterned the area I needed. This piece, though, is made with 2mm foam and black Warbler. The Warbler is heat up, sandwiched, cut out and shaped. Black Warbler especially is sensitive to too much heat and the risk of air bubbles is much higher. The only advice I have is to go slow with your heat and work as fast as you can to avoid having to reheat. That sounds like I just told you to do 2 very opposite things, but it'll make sense once you do it. The benefits of Black Warbler is that it has a thinner texture that's easier to prime away and can be carved into much finer details than Brown Warbler. But if strength is what you need, this isn't it. So I initially made my finger armor out of Warbler 2. I used my scraps, heat them up and press them through the pasta roller in order to stack and shape. I finished them entirely, paint and all, glued them down to my glove, and I decided I hated it. I ripped them off and I had to remake the glove, and I made the finger bits out of foam. Only the top of the hand pieces remained Warbler. Here are some arbitrary cuts of foam I apparently decided would make up the final thickness of my shoulder armor. Sorry, sometimes I think something will be so damn obvious later, and then I rewatch these, and more often than not, I always say to myself, what am I doing right there? Oh yeah, okay. Anyways, this little bit is going to serve as the base things can begin to stack onto, as well as serve as the area I'll connect my attachments to for my breastplate. The more layers build up, I'm using a foam ruler in the corresponding thickness to check how much to increase the length of my pieces. This piece is pinned on, and the next slice is patterned, extended, and cut. I'm not gluing these on yet though, I'm only marking where it will go so I can sand the texture within that region. Once the texture is sanded, I'm gluing the raised detail, sanding the edge, tapering the area for the strip, and then gluing the second piece down. The third remains unglued in order to pattern the fourth before being able to mark the textured region. Texturing it, raised details, sanding, and finally gluing. You'll notice the end of layer number 1 is textured as well. This is because I was worried that you might be able to see inside at some angles in which it would be visible, but I was very wrong. It's very, very hidden. This process continues over and over again until the correct number of strips are detailed and added. I had also done some measuring and some math to determine the spacing between these pieces to match the reference. And finally, I can heat seal it, add dozens of rivets, quick seal, and a bit of light sanding. My sanding looks rough and aggressive, by the way, but I promise it isn't. And for anyone who's curious, I'm using 200 grit sandpaper for any rough textured areas, and then switching to something around 1000 grit. Moving on to the legs, so let's start from the ground up. I don't want to condemn a pair of shoes, so I'm sewing up some boot covers for a pair that I know fit well and comfortably. I happen to have a nice blue stretch fabric in my stash, so I'm seaming it all up with a zigzag stitch and adding a zipper to the back. And since this zipper was too long, I'm cutting it to the size and sewing a stopper around the teeth to prevent the cursor from flying off. To pattern and place the armor for the shoes, I'm doing the old clear wrap duct tape technique again and cutting it free. I might have to lengthen some of these pattern pieces, so I'm using my foam ruler to check the difference 4mm foam would cause. There turned out to be about a 1 centimeter difference. Following a reference perfectly sometimes isn't the right thing to do. We all have different bodies, and in a lot of different cases, the materials we might be using might differ from the original. It's good to adapt the shapes and placements of pieces to your body. For the toe pieces, I purposely rounded the edges of the seam in order to make it more deliberate. The rest of these steps are the same as the rest of the armor. All that's missing now is some heat shaping and a few bits here and there before they get primed. Moving up to the legs, I'm patterning the seams here strategically, connecting the base, marking the spots for the bevel cuts, said bevel cuts, glue, and so on. The knee portion of the shin guards rely on beveled cuts of some pieces, since the technique previously used wouldn't work this time around, since the shape must be 3 pieces and that wouldn't work as 1. For the same reason as the shoes, I didn't make each section here a layer to avoid excess bulk. And for what difference layers of 2mm would make, it just isn't worth the extra work. Alright, time to prime the surface. Priming helps smooth out layers and clog the pores of the foam that heat sealing missed. I tend to do about 3 layers since plastic dip here is a little expensive, but if you live somewhere where it's cheap, 5 layers and you're golden. Having the plastic dip over the googly eyes also helps hold them in place if you are not sure about your glue. It'll prevent them from falling off since they're sort of enveloped with the rest of the layer. For the warbler parts, I use Duplicolor Automotive Filler Primer. Sand it, 1 final layer, and then sand again before paint. Now my painting is a little hectic since I wanted to base coat everything in one sitting. I mixed some airbrush medium with a nice blue paint I found on Amazon. It has a very subtle sparkle to it. The subtle sparkle will help that texture show up in photos too, since it's going to catch more light. Plans changed though, since one sitting didn't quite cut it since I ran out of paint and had to reorder more. Black acrylic paint is mixed with water to do a wash all over the parts I want to dull down. Now I'm swirling some low coverage silver paint to add an overlay, and as a result I get the bluish silver that matches the rest of the armor. A couple areas on other pieces get the same treatment. Now the raised details get properly base coated with black to provide an even surface. I usually like using oil paint to shade my armor, but I want to practice with acrylic paint, so I'm using a watered down mixture again. Only slightly watered down though, since the paint I have is already a little bit liquidy. Once all the blue parts are shaded, I'm base coating those raised details with black as well. The process is repeated on every single piece of armor. And at this point, I can glue on that detail piece meant for the belt. Now I can move on to using that same low coverage silver on the details based in black. I like the low coverage sometimes, especially if I want to do an overlay, or if I want to be able to build up my paint to have a dull look. Now the silver parts need to be shaded too. I have one brush to apply the paint and another to spread the paint out. This helps me get a more smooth gradient since I'm not looking for a dirty look. I let any spray paint, spray varnish, etc. sit for a few days, by the way, to ensure that it's completely set. This avoids any chemical reaction that would ruin your paint job, and I learned that the hard way. I was getting pretty excited about this armor being close to done, so I didn't care that it was dark out and I went out there to seal the paint job anyways. Some final heat shaping can be done now, and all the small parts can be glued to their respective spots. The arms were especially hard to do since I live alone. Gutermann Creative Glue is used on anything being stuck to fabric, and before sticking anything to faux leather or vinyl, the surface is scratched up. Surfaces needing Velcro are also marked and scratched up by scoring and applying heat. Since foam is so light, I can trust that these will not go anywhere ever. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and if you like watching walkthroughs and processes of making costumes, I do stream on Twitch. There's links down in the description. There's also a link to the Discord and other socials as well if you want to share some of the work that you've done, whether it be relevant to this universe or not. We love seeing people's artwork. I would also love to thank my Twitch subscribers. Thank you so much. Your support is greatly appreciated as always, and hopefully I'll see you guys very soon in the next stream. And in the next part in this series, we are going to be making Des and Troy. Because when you put them together, they destroy. See you next time. Don't you know what I'm saying? Don't you know what I'm saying?